Otherwise now, Matilda 1, if it does make it round in the our arena, Matilda 1 coming on now, code word, and the name's stuck with the vehicle. Technically it was the A12 infantry tank, steaming merrily away there out the engine bay at the back. Two-man crew, and that was a bit of a problem. Commander in the top, he's got to fire that machine gun, it's a Vickers machine gun, driver down the front. The problem with a vehicle like this is if the commander wants to command, he's got the problem of having to direct, fire a machine gun, and if he wants to use his radio, it's on the floor at the back of the tank behind him. So he's got a real problem there of having to basically disengage with these two other tasks if he wants to send a message. But you can see exposed running gear, very thick armour though, surprisingly thick armour on the front of this vehicle, the one-man turret, and on that vehicle as well you'll notice painted these what are called Chinese eyes. This is an issue that started in the First World War when a Chinese businessman actually funded a British tank that was used by the 4th Royal Tank Regiment, or 4th Battalion of the Royal Tank Regiment, and he insisted eyes were painted on the tank so it could see where it was going. And the regiment consequently has painted eyes on these tanks ever since, and this is painted as a vehicle that was used by the 4th Royal Tank Regiment in the Second World War. Now, we left most of these vehicles behind us in France at the end of the campaign in 1940. Some of them were actually recovered by the Germans and put to use. They were actually used for patrolling duties by the German army out in Poland, of all things. But it was already superseded in the British infantry tank design by the Matilda 2 that we'll be seeing coming on in a moment. Thick armour, relatively slow, but now the replacement for the Matilda 1, the Matilda 2, which is just gently easing its way around the corner now, this turned out to be a very, very good tank indeed. And those of you who know all your tank history, we have a little bit of tendency to kaleidoscope history. We look back, judge them with the benefit of hindsight, and there is a bit of a tendency to say all the British tanks weren't very good. In actual fact, this tank coming on now, the Matilda 2, was a superb tank in 1940. It frightened the Germans no end. It had got very, very thick armour. The German standard 37mm anti-tank gun could not penetrate the armour on this vehicle. And surprisingly enough, it was reading the reports of the strength of the armour of this tank. Hitler read these reports, and it was that reason that he insisted on the German army starting the Tiger programme. And a lot of people often think that the Tiger was designed after the invasion of Russia, when the German army met the famous T-34 tank that we'll see a bit later on. In actual fact, Hitler starts the Tiger programme in May of 1941, before they even invade Russia. He insists that the German army has a massively powerful tank. And one of those reasons is because he's read the reports of how good the British Matilda 2 tank was in France in 1940 and out in the North African desert against the Italians. Now this has got a larger crew, it's got a 3-man crew, you've got a 2-pounder gun there. Now it's always very confusing when we talk about gun sizes. In Britain we had the weight of the shell that the gun fired was used to measure the type of gun it was. So 2 pounds in weight, 2-pounder shell that was fired from that gun. And in the early 1940s, that tank gun would have fired a round through any known German tank at the time. It was very, very effective. It's about 40mm in size across the end of the barrel, to give you an indication. And it was a high velocity gun. The rounds came out at the end of the barrel with a tremendous amount of force behind them. This particular tank, it's painted in a scheme called the Quarter scheme. It was a scheme designed for use in the desert, and this particular tank has been painted in the markings that was used by a VC winner called Foote out in the desert. It's a rare survivor in the sense it's a rare vehicle running, and I'm so pleased it's actually made it round the track and stopped in front of you there. Braking the track on one side, other side keeps going, and that's how a tank's pushed round the corner. The only wheels that are being driven by the engine are the ones with the spokes on. They're the powered wheels on the ground that are just taking the weight of the vehicle, spreading the heavy weight of that tank out across the tracks. The army says to him, we're going to need about 10 years to build up the army into a strong enough force. So they start in Germany from 1933 onwards, building on some secret work they've been doing before the war, or before 1933. They design a Panzer I and a Panzer II, which really turn out to be their training tanks. And it's this tank coming on now, the Panzer III, and another tank that we have inside the museum, the Panzer IV. Those were the tanks that the army was actually going to go to war in. Now, the Panzer III that you see in front of you was actually captured in North Africa by British forces and taken back to the United Kingdom for evaluation. This is an L model. With the German army, instead of going Mark I, Mark II, it's Auftrag or version A, B, C, D. And this one's an L, so it's later in the production run. And again, the Germans are very clever. They design their tanks in such a manner that they can upgrade them. They can add bigger guns, they can add more armour plate. Now, this particular Panzer III, it started the war with a short-barreled, medium-velocity 50mm gun on. So what does all that mean? 50mm, again, the size of the hole at the end of the barrel, 50mm across. Medium velocity, the rounds come out with a medium amount of force. Now, as the Germans met our tanks with bigger and thicker armour plate on them, we end up, or the Germans end up, putting bigger guns on their tanks. Now, this gun, it's a 50mm gun as well, but it's a high velocity, longer barreled gun. So it was put on the tanks later in the war, so it had more penetration. It could penetrate more armour when it was firing against other tanks. And you'll also notice as the vehicle drives past you, they've bolted extra armour protection on the front of the vehicle. So there's more armour plate on this vehicle to give it that extra layer of protection when we were putting bigger guns like the 6-pounders on our tank. Now, this particular Panzer III, it was restored by the museum some years ago. It's pretty much been kept in running order since it was captured, but it's a typical example of the tremendously good German engineering that they put into their tank design and quality engineering. Everything about this tank is made to last, and we'll see that contrasts quite considerably with how other countries approach tanks later on in the war. Panzer III has a crew of 5 in it, 3 guys in the turret, commander right in the middle. And when this tank was captured, one of the things the British report said about it, they liked the way that the tank commander was in eye line and contact with most of the crew members inside. That means you can reassure the rest of. Now, some of you who know about tanks, you know about this one coming on now. This is the famous Russian tank called the T-34. Very distinctive tank. You can hear that. That's the pins holding the track together being knocked back into place by a little wedge that's on the inside of the hull of the vehicle as it drives along. Now, the Russians had a very different idea to tanks. They looked at tanks a bit like we might look at a hand grenade. It's a munition. They knew it had to do a job, but let's keep it simple. The Russian order of battle, the way they were going to fight, was use as many tanks as you needed to get from A to B. Here's some more, we're going to build you some more if you run out of those ones. So they kept the design of their tanks very, very simple, and crew comfort inside this vehicle is absolutely appalling. But then we have to remember, of course, the Russians, they're a dictatorship as well. If you didn't want to serve on this tank, you were off to a penal battalion, and they find the next man to get in the tank instead. Now, this particular Russian tank, this one is actually a T-34-85. They start the war with something called the T-34-76, a 76mm gun, a smaller gun, 2-man turret. This is a much larger turret put on later in the war with a bigger gun on it, an 85mm gun. And as we said, the Russian mentality is make lots and lots of tanks. They make them well, they make them very simple, so they can make a lot of them. This one's marked up as a Polish tank, and we think this one was actually made in Poland just after the war, but it's a wonderful example of that simple Russian design. Sloped armour, And if you slope armour, basically you increase. Really designed in the first place for a tank slightly lighter, a 36-ton tank, and a cause of endless troubles not only to the crew in World War II, but subsequently. But the truth is, most tank engines on most variants of tanks cause trouble. It's not just with the Tiger. Now our Tiger, as many of you know, was captured in North Africa, in Tunisia, in early 1943. It was the first complete Tiger captured by the British forces, by all the Allied Western forces, and it was seen by Churchill in Tunis, by the King went out there and took a look at it as well. It was brought back to Britain for evaluation, and it came down to the Tank Museum in 1951, and it's been the subject of an ongoing restoration project really for over the last 10 years. We've just done some more work on the tank. We've fitted something called the fan drives in the back so that we can now authentically turn the fans to keep the engine